Natasha tweeted and was just saying a bunch about pride and how proud she was of this team. Have you kind of had similar emotions the last couple of days, and how do you balance that with a very painful?
Nobody expected it in the BA and WW, a player who struggled to stay on the roster for her first 2 seasons, doubting every shot she made and silently worrying that today would be her release date. Then, almost overnight, everything changed. In addition to going through the biggest transformation in women's basketball history, Lexie Hull became one of its most fascinating stories. And now, after being at the center of the Caitlin Clark hurricane for years, she has finally opened up about what it's been like. Not the polished media version, but the real one. Furthermore, nobody truly expected what she revealed. Before any of this makes sense, you have to understand where Lexie Hull was before Caitlin Clark ever set foot in Gainbridge Fieldhouse. Hull was chosen by the Indiana Fever with the 6th overall pick in the 2022 draft. On paper, that sounds like a dream. 6th place overall. Top 10 options. A Stanford alumna who won a national championship, 3 All-Pac, 12 selections, and the Class Award and Elite 90 Award for academic and athletic excellence in her final year. This was supposed to be the starting point. Instead, it turned into a grind that was mostly invisible to outsiders. Not quite as good because of the unfavorable Fever during those early years. They alternated between losing seasons and missing the playoffs entirely, making them one of the worst teams in the league. And Hull found herself in a situation that no young athlete wants to be in, fighting non-stop to stay on the team. Every single night was important. Each item had an unhealthy significance. She knew she was acting scared. During her first 2 seasons, she averaged less than 5 points per game. In her second year, she played for over 20 minutes each night, but she only managed 4 points. 6 points. The figures are accurate. She was being held back by something, and Hull would eventually identify it. Few athletes are ever willing to talk openly about their early years, as she did. When I first started, it seemed like if I shoot, they require to go in because otherwise I might be put on the bench or I might be cut. She said to Glamour magazine, "Go back and read that." A Stanford finished school, a top 10 draft pick, and someone with outstanding credentials are lying awake with a serious worry that one botched shot could ruin her career. Playing on a losing team with nothing to soften the blow was that reality. She recognized that those initial years were really nerve-wracking. A losing culture, no the semifinals, no the stakes were astronomical. Therefore, everything counted. Furthermore, that type for pressure affects significantly more than just your shot. It enters your head. It impacts how you move and think. The method in which you breathe while playing. It was smothering Hull, and the Fever was going ignored by everyone outside. However, something occurred that affected not only Lexie Hull's career, but perhaps the franchise's overall course and probably the American women's basketball landscape as a whole. Caitlin Clark was chosen by the Indiana Fever with the 1st overall pick in the 2024 WNBA draft. Here's a brief outline of Caitlin Clark's demeanor at the time, to the extent you need a reminder. The most decorated scorer in NCAA basketball history, regardless of gender. A player who single-handedly turned Big Ten women's basketball into a must-watch event, broke decades-old records and turned Iowa Hawkeyes games into full houses television events. The entire WNBA was about to find out if the hubbub surrounding her, which was never before witnessed for a women's basketball player, was genuine. It was genuine. Her record-breaking fan involvement and output during her inaugural season confirmed her spot as the league's most significant player. And all of a sudden, the Indiana Fever emerged as the most watched, discussed, controversial, and well-known team in the WNBA. Everywhere they went, there were national broadcasts, sold-out audiences, and a media frenzy. Everything came together when Caitlin Clark put on the Indiana Fever tee, and Lexie Hull was present for every second of it. This is rarely discussed when discussing Caitlin Clark's influence on her teammates. There were other factors besides visibility. Larger crowds, sponsorship agreements, and the cameras that followed them weren't the only factors. For Lexie Hull, what happens inside the lines during a game is the biggest change. It's almost invisible until you know what you're looking for. Caitlin Clark has a different viewpoint on the floor than almost everyone who has ever played this game. Because of her extraordinary passing and court vision, as well as the way she attracts defenders, coaches have fantasies about her. Open perimeter shooters with no obstacles in their path. For someone like Lexie Hull, who had tortured herself over every shot attempt for 2 years, that was nothing short of liberating. Hull's description: the transition takes on a new significance when you take into account what came before it. I know I'm going to get open shots after Clark arrived, she said. However, I don't have to worry about whether or not they enter because I've put a lot of effort into getting ready for this. I'll accept the outcome. That's not just confidence, that's freedom. The kind of freedom that can only be attained once the pressure valve is eventually unlocked. And the numbers backed it up. In 2024, Hull's three-point percentage was 47.1%. It was one of the league's most successful shooting performances that year and a lifetime best. Without Clark's passing creating those opportunities, her three-point percentage dropped back to 36.7%, precisely where she had been when attending college. The statistics tell the narrative even more effectively than the words. But when you take into account that the transformation wasn't confined to the court, this story becomes far more fascinating. This is because Lexie Hull and Caitlin Clark's off-court relationship generated controversy, garnered media attention, and became one of the most talked-about friendships in women's sports. When Clark was drafted, many truly concerned how she would adjust to a locker strangers, two of her childhood friends, Kate Martin and Gabby Marshall. Throughout her 4 years at Iowa, her closest pals were her teammates. When she arrived in Indiana, she was the new face of the franchise in a room where everyone else had already established relationships. The concern was real. Would she fit in well? Would her interest insult the present players, or would they embrace her? And this is what actually happened. Almost immediately, she and Lexie fell in love. At the conclusion of that first season, they were hanging out off the court in Indianapolis. They were sharing videos on TikTok, laughing, and trying with various drinks as if they had been friends for years. The WNBA traveled to Mexico during the Olympic break. There was no doubting the chemistry, and fans adored it. However, by 2025, the dynamic had developed to the point where it was known by a different name. When Sophie Cunningham was traded to Indiana in the off-season prior to the season, what had been a duet became a trio. The three of them, Clark, Hull, and Cunningham, started calling themselves the Traceleches, and their collaborative efforts created some of the most well-liked and humorous content in the league. Hull and Cunningham were Clark's well-known caddies at an LPGA Pro-Am event. On social media, they were always making fun of one another. When Clark posted photos from Fever Media Day to Instagram, he wrote, "We are so back." In retaliation, Hull ridiculed Clark's lack of sun exposure. In one of the most hilarious comments of the offseason, he told People magazine that Clark would potentially profit from having a little sun. It was the kind of teasing that only happens in friendships where both people are genuinely comfortable with each other. It also gave the WNBA fanbase something they had never really had a glimpse inside the personalities of the sportsmen. Additionally, Hull revealed that Clark will be there for her wedding, which has been scheduled, and former Pittsburgh Pirates pitcher Will Matheson got engaged in April 2025. The two originally met at Stanford, where Matheson was a standout baseball player before getting chosen in the 6th round of the 2019 MLB draft. After retiring from baseball due to a series of illnesses, he relocated to Indianapolis to be with Hull, which says a lot about the basis of her life. Hull chose to face a side of playing with Caitlin Clark in a way that most people in her position would have disregarded or avoided entirely, despite the fact that everything has been lovely and delightful. And it's the part of the story that deserves the most attention. The 2025 WNBA season was one of the most divisive in the league's history. Hull described Clark's arrival as having a certain air, a seriousness, a focus, and an edge that suggested she was ready to reign and had finished adjusting. Hull told reporters before to the start of the season that Clark was obviously different in his, "There's a clear sense that she's here and ready to do business," according to Hull. That read seemed to be exactly right at first. Through the first 7 games of 2025, Hull is playing the finest basketball of her career. She led the WNBA in three-point percentage at 55%. 6%, and averaged over 10 points per game. The Fever showed up to finally be a cohesive team. Then the injuries started. Clark's quad issue caused him to miss multiple games. Then there was an issue with the groin. Another soft tissue problem followed. On July 15, Clark was injured on the sidelines during a game against the Connecticut Sun for the fourth time in a few months, which was one of the most tragic moments of the season. Clark seemed to be fighting back tears as she got off the floor, leaned her forehead against the basket stanchion, and sat on the bench with a towel over her face after giving it all and seeing everything fall apart, and Lexie Hull was seated by her. Real friend does when words can't express how they feel. Hull later spoke openly about Clark's leadership role at the time and the why me questions. She was annoyed that her body would not cooperate even though she was working harder than anybody else in the building. It was a difficult chapter. Despite Clark missing a significant amount of the season, the Fever still managed to win. They persisted all the way to the WNBA semifinals, where they prevailed against the eventual champion Las Vegas in a pivotal Game 5 that needed overtime before Indiana succumbed. The run was made possible in large part by Hull's two-way tenacity, which isn't visible in a box score, taking charge, making plays that kept games close when the team needed them, and defending the opposing team's top.